of the church has been that of spiritual poverty. If you were to gauge throughout the history of the church, how many people, if there was such a thing as a poverty line in the church having to do with spiritual things, I would say that the vast majority of people live beneath the poverty line when it comes to things of the spirit. And for the most part, we're spiritually impoverished. And that's a persistent problem. And it's a problem here today. Well, most of us do not enjoy spiritual wealth, but rather know instead of spiritual poverty. Now imagine that your spiritual poverty was on trial today. And you were going to have it tried as a case. And you walked into our courtroom. And as you walked into the courtroom to have your spiritual poverty put on trial, there was a judge seated behind his desk, there was a jury in the jury box, and there was a gallery full of onlookers and witnesses. And as you walked into that courtroom, you had to make a decision. Am I going to stand behind the plaintiff's podium or the defendant's podium? Which podium would you stand behind? With your spiritual poverty on trial, are you going to assume the position of a plaintiff in the matter, or are you going to assume the position of a defendant? Now, both of those positions are assumed by believers today and throughout all of time. I'll explain to you how the plaintiff, why somebody would become a plaintiff in this case of their spiritual poverty. The plaintiff, the person who walks into this trial and stands behind the plaintiff's position, what the plaintiff is saying is that somebody else bears the responsibility for my spiritual poverty. I am not necessarily to blame. And what the plaintiff in this matter will say is he'll say, the person, or the persons who are to blame, first of all, is the person of Adam. Adam, my ancestor, both physical and spiritual, he committed the rebellion against God. He was the one who sinned against God, and by virtue of his eating of the forbidden fruit and his wife's eating of the forbidden fruit, I now am bound. I have no other, I'm destined and doomed to failure. I have a sin nature. My heart desires evil continually. And I have inherited that from Adam. And so my spiritual poverty is not necessarily my blame, but rather the blame of those who came before me, who ruined the good thing. The image of God is in me, but it's so far tarnished and so far clouded and cluttered and marred by the acts of people before me that I can't help but be impoverished. And that's not the only argument they make. They also make the argument that not only is Adam to blame for their spiritual poverty, but in a sense, God himself is to blame as well, because they accurately state that I can only know of God what God reveals to me. And if my understanding of God, if my closeness and relationship to God is entirely dependent on how much of himself he makes known to me, if then I am living in spiritual poverty, it must be because I don't know much of God. I'm not living very close to him. I'm not near him. And so God, I can't make God reveal himself to me. You know, hey, here I am. I'm just born into this place with a sinful heart, and you know, I can't build it. We tried to build the Tower of Babel to get near God, and he shut that down. I mean, what am I supposed to do? I can't just bust the gates of heaven. If God doesn't make himself known to me, what am I supposed to do? And then the final argument that the plaintiff makes is that, don't you see my unhappiness? He will cite as Exhibit A for his innocence, his unhappiness and his tears of frustration. The person who assumes the plaintiff position will say, I am unhappy. I am crying out. I'm frustrated by my life. I'm not living as I ought. I know I'm impoverished spiritually, and I don't like it. And so my spiritual poverty, you know, if I was guilty, I would be happy to be impoverished, and I'd be glad for the work of Adam and freeing me from the presence of God. But quite the opposite is true. Well, that's the plaintiff position. And many believers assume that position. And maybe some of you today are a plaintiff in the case of your spiritual poverty. Of course, the other podium that you can stand behind, the other position that you can assume, is the position of a defendant in this case. And what the defendant does when he stands behind that podium is he says, I alone bear sole responsibility for my spiritual poverty. I'm not blaming anybody else. I am poor today spiritually because I have chosen to be poor today. It's my fault. and my fault alone and altogether. And they too cite as Exhibit A their tears and frustration. But they don't see their unhappiness and they don't see their tears and frustration as proof of their innocence, but rather as proof of their guilt. My frustration and my tears and my unhappiness proves only the fact that I am indeed guilty. Well, it's to this point that this passage is preaching here today, that this account between Elisha and Joash, the king of Israel, that's what this is about. Because even a toddler who reads this passage it will pose the very simple question that's being posed in this passage. And in this passage, it's a question that every believer must have answered at some point. And the question that is inescapable after reading this passage is this: are God's blessings limited by my unbelief? Are the blessings of God, I'm talking about all the wealth and blessings of God, are they limited in some respect by how much belief I have in them? You know, can I only see what it is that I believe, is what's being asked. Are accessibility and availability two very different things? And I think for most people the question is there endless availability to God and to His blessings and to knowing Him and walking in strength and victory? Is that all available for me? But is my access restricted? Do I only have so much access to it? And is that access, is the restriction of that access, is it entirely due to my belief, how much belief I have? That the more belief I have, the more blessings I have. Just to give you a visual illustration of this from Scripture, think of the very often quoted and read story of Peter and his walking on the water. As Peter is standing in the boat, Jesus is not swimming in the water. If Jesus is in the water swimming, and Peter wanted to be with Jesus, he'd have no problem jumping in the water and being with Jesus as they're swimming together in the sea. And the reason for that is that Peter has been swimming his entire life. He grew up on the water. He knows swimming. He's comfortable swimming in the water and floating and keeping above water. He knows what that's like. But because Jesus was not swimming in the water, but in fact standing on top of it, that's something that Peter has no experience in whatsoever. And so for Peter, if he wants to be near Jesus, what does he have to do? He has to have a faith and a belief and an ability that as yet he's restricted in. He doesn't have that faith or that belief or that ability. And so if he wants to be near God, he's going to have to increase his faith and belief, isn't he? Because he has never heretofore walked on water. And so in this instance, fellowship with Jesus was entirely possible, right? But Peter's access to Jesus was restricted by his lack of faith. Because certainly when Jesus said, well, certainly, Peter, come and walk to me, it was then that Peter was endowed with that faith and belief. He did believe, and indeed he did walk on the water. It is possible. Okay. And so, apart from walking on water and physics and stuff like that, how many things, Jesus today, figuratively, is standing in places that we'd like to go and be with him in. But we do not go to be with him. We do not have fellowship with Jesus in some of the deeper and more wonderful places in the Christian life, simply because our faith is not of a strength and of a degree that we're able to go to him. Because our faith is very simple. We're able to fellowship with God when God is in places that we are familiar with. We can fellowship with God when we're sitting in a church setting like this, or when we're reading our devotional book at the table in the morning with our coffee and so forth. There are some aspects in which we're very comfortable being with Jesus, but then there are some aspects about being with Jesus that we just don't have the endurance for, we don't have the faith or the belief for. And so that's the major question that all of us have to have answered today. Because